Welcome to the seventh presentation in the series where we're looking at education as it moves into the future, seeking to gather and bring together the evidence to help us to plan. What does the evidence from research tell us? The theme for this presentation relates to how we can share our research findings. A very important part of the research process, to make the findings known for fellow researchers, yes, but even more important, for those who are directly involved in teaching at any level. There are numerous kinds of publications and numerous levels of publications. I'm just going to put up three as examples. Here is a research review. It's full of references, but it's written in such a way that almost anybody can read it. It's designed for teachers and examination setters, and it covers assessment specifically at the school level. There is a high-status international journal for which there are clear standards, criteria set, and careful refereeing of all papers. And there's a book which is a specialist review, commissioned by a learned society and designed for easy access for the reader, so that things can be implemented to help the practicing teacher at all levels. But it's tied into chemistry specifically. And there are numerous other types of publications. Well, you've got your computer, you've got your blank screen, you've pulled up a page and your first paper is about to be launched. How do we start? There are two words that are quite important. What is your purpose in writing? And for whom are you writing? Sounds obvious, but it's amazing how many papers and how many publications attempts are made without addressing these two central issues at the outset, because they determine what you write and how you write it. We don't cover everything. We cover what's relevant to fulfill our purpose with a specific readership, and we write it with that readership in mind. That's, if you like, is the starting point. A series of questions. It's worth asking these of yourself. Why are you wanting to write anyway? Is it just that? It just so happens that if you want to move up in the academic game that people play today, then publications is a big part of it. Do we actually want to inform other academic researchers, some of whom we will know personally, others will not be known to us? Or are we wanting to share our findings with teachers and teacher trainers, so that the findings can bring benefit to future learners? Or we want to share our findings with those who take policy decisions? Now, there are several different possibilities, and there may be more. They're not mutually exclusive. But in the end of the day, if research is to bring any benefit and have any purpose, it must bring benefit to learners. And that means that we've got to inform teachers, teacher trainers, and policy planners. The evidence shows that teachers are willing to listen. Teacher trainers, not quite so enthusiastic. Education policy planners more or less never read research findings. Where are you wanting to write? There's all kinds of journals in your own country, your local area, your local university. Or are we looking at international journals, which often have very key, precise target audiences in mind? Or is it a specialist journal that deals with a particular kind of area, or a particular kind of population, or a particular subject or group of subjects, or a particular level of education? Is it a book that generates the proceedings from a conference? You've spoken, now you're asked to produce a paper which will be published. Or is it a monograph that brings together a lot of things from yourself and from others with a clearly targeted audience? Or a book chapter where you've got to fit in with other authors, but at the same time you're not quite sure who's going to read it? Or are you thinking of writing a complete book? A daunting prospect. Now, if you're looking at journals, you've got to follow the writing criteria of the particular journal. And it's laid down in the journals quite clearly what's required. If it's conference proceedings where you've got to check with the organisers exactly how they want it, and you've got to conform to that style. A monograph, well, you've got to be very clear about the audience and target it relentlessly at that audience. A book chapter or a complete book, well, publishers have got clear criteria and house styles, and we have to conform to these. Well, are you going to do it on your own or with somebody else? My advice is start by learning from someone with more experience. It's not easy to write. Very few launch into it with success instantly. We do need support, guidance and help. And we've got to think about the ideal partner. Someone we can work with. Someone who can tell us what they think of what we're writing with honesty without causing us offence. So we do require somebody that we can trust, who has honesty. And that's so important. Writing involves teamwork, but very often in a team, someone is the leader. That's all got to be thought through carefully. Otherwise, we go on our own. But we need to draw from the experience of others at the start before we even think about going on our own. Well, how are you going to do it? You've got to work within the structures laid down by the specific journal. So think about the journal or possible journals at the outset. Use straightforward English. Don't use complex English. It's not required. Many people, English is their second language, many who will read it. Stay with straightforward English. You don't need to have it complex. So avoid complex language, complex words, complex sentences. Keep them short. Just say what you want to say. Think about speaking it out and then write it down the way you'd speak it. You're aiming for communication, not confusion. But it must all be based on evidence. You're not expressing your opinions. You're not gathering the opinions of others. What is the evidence? That's the purpose of research. So make sure that all the data you use are checked carefully. It's very easy for slips to slip through. And make sure your conclusions are based on the evidence. They're not your bright ideas, no matter how good the ideas may be. Research relates to evidence. The conclusions must reflect it. And of course the references have to be in the style that's required by the journal. It may not be the style you like, but you've got to conform to that. They're there for good reasons. The best way to write? Well, this is what I found is the best way, and I know I'm not alone in this. Start with the experimental section, where you've gathered your data. Because when you sort that out, it becomes clear to you whether it's worth publishing at all. Then draw the conclusions from your experimental data. And ask that serious question. An awful lot of publications in journals today, you look at them and you just shake your head. Someone spent a lot of time and a lot of effort, but it hasn't taken us forward at all, and it's of no value to any practicing teacher. Therefore, no learner is going to gain benefit. What's the point of doing it? Having got to that, assuming that you think it's worth going on, now bring in the background literature and previous findings. Now watch carefully here. Don't make it comprehensive. Be highly selective. You're focusing on it the very specific things that relate to what you've done and the purpose in what you've done. And don't just say according to so-and-so and quote some reference. It's not a matter of opinion. Only quote people who've actually said something and have the evidence for it. So someone said, or found, or deduced, or observed. Not according to. And then finish it by doing the introduction, the references, and the abstract. The abstract's the most difficult part. You write the introduction because only when you've done the experimental, drawn your conclusions, and got the literature in, do you see the overall picture. And that gives you the key to the introduction, which can probably be quite short. And then you've got to check all the references are there and none is missed. Problems? Some key questions. That's the most fundamental one. It's amazing how in many journals you look at the papers and you just look at it and say, was that worth publishing? Journals have multiplied in the last few decades. There's still wonderful stuff out there, but in education there's an awful lot that signifies nothing. And if you've just got a descriptive study based on questionnaires, don't bother publishing it. It's not worth it. That's just a collation of opinions. If you've got that, plus a lot of other things as well, yes, it might be worth publishing. But there's far too many that just are descriptive exploratory studies, looking at questionnaires, often the data handled wrongly. They're not worth the paper they're written on. Waste of time. Make sure your statistics are right. The last presentation dealt with that. If you're not confident, take advice from somebody who knows. Ask yourself the question, is the language clear? Be very, very careful over that. In education today, there's an awful lot of what I've called abstraction, using complicated words, descriptions, and phrases. And people think that they're impressing others. That's not erudition. That's not scholarship. That's not depth. That's confusion. And don't think because you label something that it explains anything. And avoid complex words or language. If you can use simple, straightforward English language, use it. And avoid the technical stuff unless you have to use it. And explain how you're using the words and what they mean. Make sure the conclusions are actually drawn from the data. The number of papers I've seen where people just give the findings of some questionnaire, exploratory and descriptive, and then at the end they put up their opinions. That's not research. It's not worth publishing. So making clever suggestions, no matter how clever you may be, and you may have some very good ideas, that's not research. That's not the place for publishing these kind of things. Now, this is a harsh one to say, but there are journals that require what I've called flawed features. Things like that. If they demand a theoretical framework, or research questions, or data separated from discussion, or the experimental model employed, some jargon phrase, or a long methodology section, or hypothesis. These are all flawed, and I've showed previously why they're flawed in a previous presentation. Now you may have to put up with one or two of these at most, but if they're coming up with these things, go and look for another journal. Just boycott journals that go down that stupid way. Theoretical frameworks tie us in knots. Research questions close options. We can only make sense of data when we discuss it. Labeling the experimental model used like quasi-experimental or exploratory signifies nothing, it's just jargon words. Methodology, just say what you did, how you did it. Hypothesis are almost never hypotheses, because these journals don't understand the meaning of the word. Now these are harsh things to say, but I'm saying them bluntly. Don't bother publishing in these journals. Think about the kind of people who read them. You're not going to make any impact. Just say what you did and why. In ordinary English. Then at the end, make sure that the technical features are correct. If it requires a certain types of headings or sections, or the abstract's not allowed to be above a certain length, references have got to be a certain format, diagrams have got to be labelled in a certain way, and so on, make sure these are all correct. It just saves a lot of problems later on. And then check every reference. Boringly slow, but check it. Now there are computer programs that will do it for you, but to set it up just about takes as much time. The best sequence? Now for the moment let's think of a research paper in a research journal. Typically journals will have a maximum word length of about 4,000, but check what the word length is for a specific journal. It does vary. Now think of the reader. Who are you trying to communicate with? What are you trying to communicate? What's their background? How will they get to it? What will they think of it? The abstract is designed so that the reader can judge its relevance, and often these abstracts can be got online, although you may have to pay the journal for the paper. The introduction, a general background and context. Keep it short. The review must be critical. You're not just quoting and citing. You're bringing ideas together, and they must be relevant to what you're doing, and you must weigh their significance. Then just say what you've done, how it was done. That's quite enough in one paragraph. And then explain what you found. The best way is to combine the data and the interpretation, because that makes greater sense to the reader. But there are one or two journals that insist on separation. Not a disaster, but it's better bringing them together. And then look at the significance or meaning, the implications. Then you've got conclusions, which basically brings it together, summarizes what you did, why you did it, what you found, its significance, and then where it leads for the future. Not repeating the same experiment with a bigger sample, but leading on to something new. There's a kind of format for a research paper. What about a book chapter of, let's say, a monograph? Now you have to look at what the guidelines are that you've been given. Publishers have specific guidelines, specific audiences, specific ways of doing things. And then follow any required structure. Remember, you're communicating with a readership. The publishers are usually fairly well aware of the readership. Your task is to communicate clearly within their structure and tell it as a story. This often is bringing research together, maybe from multiple sources. Bring it alive. Bring the research and the way it was done alive. Its meaning alive. Make it reader friendly. Forget the jargon. Forget the abstract words. Forget the long English words. Forget the long sentences. People talk about academic writing. Academic writing just generates confusion. Those who are genuinely able to academically write are crystal clear. Read them. Listen to them. It's simple, straightforward, and yet deep. That's what you're aiming for. Make multiple use of diagrams and tables. A picture, a diagram, a table communicate far more clearly in many cases than written text. Break up the written text. Illustrate it. Exemplify it. Show how things tie together. That's based on research evidence. Very powerful. But start at the beginning by drawing the reader in. Imagine you're talking to the potential reader, your target audience. Draw them in so that you're engaging them. They don't want to put it down. They recognize its importance, significance, relevance for their teaching, for their research. And then finish with a clear message that's relevant to the readership that the monograph's designed to touch. Now that's for a book chapter or a monograph, just some sort of guidelines to help us move in that direction. Now I'm going to spend a few moments giving some examples to illustrate this. Now I'm going to take them from academic papers rather than books or monographs. But just some papers to illustrate it, and then we'll see the patterns that are common between them. And it illustrates principles that may help you as you move forward in writing. The student's attitude and cognition change to a physics laboratory. Not a great title, but a wonderful paper. Now that's published in Physics Education, which is a high-level international status paper published by the Institute of Physics. But its target audience is those who are teaching physics. Not primarily researchers. Teaching physics at school or teaching physics at university. The Institute of Physics is another journal which looks more broadly, again of international status, but this time for researchers to share with researchers. So that's the purpose of the journal, that's its target audience. This is an example, quite an old one, of crystal clear writing, which is a mastery of understatement. The journal requires a kind of a one-sentence statement of what you're doing. An experiment with undergraduates in a physics laboratory has shown that through preparation, that thorough preparation before a lab session improves students' performance in the lab, and that follow-up work can lead to meaningful learning. It goes on to outline what it was doing. The attitude change and cognition improvement in the educational setting of a physics laboratory was explored. That just says clearly and simply what it was trying to do. Reference is being made to a number of recent empirical studies in relation to science education. That's what it was built from. The proposed model, which the paper outlines, attempts to account for attitude and cognition change brought about experimentally. That's an understatement. The findings are dramatically clear. Then is a comment designed to jolt the reader. In many activities, education runs very much on an input-output model. The teachers provide the input, and the students produce output behaviours in exams or tests, or in some outward or visible performance. And then it goes on to demolish that perception and to look at things on a bigger scale. The paper itself, if I look at it, was built around the then new development of pre-laboratory exercises. Now, previous research predicted that pre-laboratory exercises would enhance learning. This was now being tested in an undergraduate physics laboratory. In other words, it started from previous work that made a prediction, and it's testing it, and it used an undergraduate physics laboratory because it's much easier to do these experiments in a university setting because you can get big numbers in a very tight, organized way. And this is actually what the study says, quoted from the study. The results that emerged from the study of the students' responses to the attitude questionnaire, so there is a questionnaire there, but there's an awful lot more. The responses tend to confirm that the pre-labs fostered a positive attitude in the students towards the changes made in the physics laboratory. Now, as someone who's been involved in attitude research for a long time, that is a gross understatement. The effects are really quite dramatic. The authors did not overclaim. They were wise. Then it looks at the major part of it. Lab scores obtained by the students for the report on the experiment, which most students wrote at the completion of the experimental work, show that with pre-lab, students' understanding of the physics practical work improved. Some students had the pre-lab experience, some didn't. So there's a comparison. Improved, again, if anything, an understatement. Markedly improved. Then it says there was a large improvement in the performance in most post-lab work when the students used pre-lab sheets before they started the experiment. That is certainly true. The prediction was fulfilled, and it was fulfilled more markedly than we might have expected. An interesting paper to get hold of. Now look at the next one. The same author who had a mastery of the English language and clarity. This is a review article. Notice it's the first issue of that journal in its history. That journal arose from discussions at a chemistry education conference. And in a matter of few years, the journal was absorbed in with another journal, retaining basically the same name, and was taken on board by the Royal Society of Chemistry, the biggest learned society in Western Europe. And it changed its name to Chemistry Education, Research and Practice, and it was totally international. And it holds the highest citation ratings in its field. This is a review paper that came out of that conference. Clever play of words, logical or psychological. Have to think about it. In the abstract, it draws teachers in, draws researcher in. Chemistry is regarded as a difficult subject for students. That's certainly true. The difficulties may lie in human learning as well as in the intrinsic nature of the subject. And Johnson himself had developed vast research programs that looked at both. He goes on, the psychology for the formation of most of the chemical concepts is quite different from that of the normal world. We have the added complication of operating on and interrelating three levels of thought: the macro-intangible, the sub-microatomic and molecular, and the representational use of symbols and mathematics. It is psychological folly to introduce learners to ideas at all three levels simultaneously. Working memory makes it impossible. And he shows that. It is a review paper. Then he goes on, chemical education research is advanced enough to offer pointers to the teacher, the administrator, and the publisher of how our subject may be more effectively shared. with our student, and he summarises some of these. And there's a lot of key words, more than you get in a normal journal article, because this is a review paper, because it brings together a lot of research. And the keywords are so important because computer searches on the internet will pick these up and direct potential readers to the paper. That paper is free and available online. The next one, genetics at school level, addressing the difficulties. This journal is a top international status journal with very strong, clear criteria to be published in it, based on work done in Taiwan. It requires the abstract to have a specific format under a specific set of headings. When you first see it, you think you're going to have your hand tied in knots by this, but it's got very good practical reasons, as I've come to discover. Just a few sentences on each. Focus makes you focus tightly, helps the reader. What are you trying to do? How did you do it? Not methodology, but methods. What measurements did you make? What you found. Just a few sentences on each. There's clear guidance given about word length. On the basis of the outcomes, the results, what conclusions and what do they mean in practice? Then you're required to put up some keywords, which is so important for search engines to pick up. Clear, tight criteria. This is what we call a double length paper, and it's the lead paper in the journal, that particular issue. Purpose of the paper? That's what was written. The main purpose of the study was to see if it was possible to recast the complete teaching program, that's in genetics, to reduce potential working memory overload and thus increase examination performance. The aim was to improve school student learning in genetics, especially conceptual understanding, to develop positive attitudes and growing awareness of the social implications of genetics. The new materials were deliberately constructed to minimize demands on working memory, in that working memory overload is known to be a key factor which hinders understanding. So it's been rooted tightly on previous research, which has been demonstrated literally hundreds, maybe thousands of times in previous studies. Genetics is a difficult area. Teachers find this really hard. Students often don't make too much sense of it. The conclusions, I've just picked up some of them. Rethinking teaching to take into account the limitations of working memory involves a change in mindset. That's honest. Simply being aware of the problem can enable the experienced teacher to watch the students as they learn, and it is possible to observe the glazed eyeball, which is often a sign that overloading is occurring. Every practicing teacher will have seen that. The natural process of learning is to seek to make sense of what is presented, as Piaget observed long ago. Working memory limitations can often make that kind of understanding impossible. Genetics, by its very nature, poses immense problems for the learner. Taking limitations of working memory into account will offer the teacher a way forward in seeking to reduce the problems. Now, Yo Chen Chu carried out the work in Taiwan. It's a very elegant piece of work, carried out with great skill. And she's made it very clear the meaning and significance of the findings that she got, which are quite clear-cut. Let's move to another one. This time in mathematics. Another international journal. At the start, it states that mathematics is well known as a subject area where there can be problems in terms of understanding as well as retaining positive attitudes. There are many who just get turned off by maths. In a large study involving 813 school students of that age range, drawn from 2 different school systems in Pakistan, the effect of limited working memory capacity and performance in maths was explored, along with a survey of areas of difficulty and student attitudes. This involved looking at student perceptions of their experiences, the nature of the difficulties they have with mathematics, and possible reasons for these difficulties. The overall aim is to explore the extent of the effect of working memory and to gain insight so that practical ways forward to enhance mathematics education can be identified. Another big study, a complex study with multiple measurements, not relying on questionnaires, but in multiple measurements, set in a very different country where life can often be quite tricky. It goes on. In terms of its conclusions, this is all taken from the abstract, which will draw the reader in. It was found that limited working memory capacity has a very strong influence on performance, confirming other studies. Indeed, if the cognitive load exceeds the capacity of working memory, understanding becomes a casualty, with consequent attitude deterioration. It ties understanding to attitudes, for which there's now clear evidence. Students need to be able to see that mathematics has a purpose of being able to be applied in real-life situations. However, attempts to develop applications may often generate further working memory overload. Again, there's a lot of evidence. Curricula devised by those outside the classroom can sometimes be inappropriate, while topics causing the greatest problems at these ages include areas of geometry, statistics, and the application of mathematics. She found that when teachers devised the curricula, the students got on a lot better and achieved higher standards. Important observation. The conclusions? One point, it looks at key issues. I've just given headings for these rather than discussing them in detail. It looks at working memory capacity and its control over understanding. Evidence for that's clear cut. If you overload it, you lose understanding, but you also lose positive attitudes. And the nature of mathematics determines why overload is so easy. And then that's a direct quotation. The development of mathematics curricula, and I've added the word must, involve practicing teachers who know the reality of the classroom situation. Curricula designed by outsiders who have never taught, there are major flaws. That's common in the world. And it looks at the mathematical topics causing greatest problems. It can identify these very clearly, why it happens, and it gives ways to reduce the problems based on evidence. Highly relevant to mathematics papers, mathematics teachers, as well as to researchers. Moving on. I've chosen just these few examples that are in diverse areas. What I want to do now is to look at, are there any common features? Any pointers that can help you as you launch into a writing career based on research? Notice that all these papers relate to the teaching of actual subjects. That's what will be relevant to teachers, because they teach students and they teach the students a subject, or maybe a group of subjects. Only at very younger ages will they be teaching across the range of subjects. All of the papers are based on the work of research students. The student did the work, the paper came out of their thesis, and the supervisor was involved with them. Sometimes two supervisors. They are all built on previous research findings, not opinions. And they all involve measurement, not opinion gathering. We're not in people's opinions. We're not interested in that. It doesn't take us forward. Even if the opinions are honestly held, they may not be right. None of them use the word instrument. That's just a fancy word for a questionnaire, so that people, if they don't know enough, can be impressed. Get rid of that word instrument. It's a delusion. They don't look at things like that. These are vague concepts that cut almost no ice with any teacher anywhere in the world. Teachers teach real students, real subjects, at all levels. And teachers want their students to be successful. Anything we can do to help that process is what research is all about. And the conclusions are clear-cut and they're based on evidence. In the first case, understated. In the other cases, probably more balanced. But understatement's better than overclaiming by a long way. We've been pushing our ball up the hill further. Publication is frustrating and hard going. Never easy. In the next presentation, we're going to move on and look at quality. It's a fashionable idea today. What on earth is it? What does education research reveal about how we consider this elusive concept of quality? And that's where we're going to move on to next.